In this SleepSense session, we're diving into the ghostly corridors of the RMS Titanic, not the ones you've seen in films or museums, but the hidden ones, the ones history chose to forget. Behind every grand staircase and velvet chair were secrets sealed beneath ice and time. Some whispered through rusted pipes, others buried with the souls who never saw sunrise. These are the stories the ocean tried to silence. But tonight, we're listening. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from today and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from across the world as we sink into history together. The band that played while drowning. They were told to leave, but they didn't. As the Titanic tilted into blackness, with steel groaning like some ancient god waking beneath the waves, 8 men in pressed uniforms gathered their instruments, not to escape, not to scream, not even to pray, but to play. Passengers swore they heard waltzes floating on the frozen wind, dancing like ghosts between the lifeboats and the screams. The ship was dying, snapping apart from the inside, but the band played on. Violins over water, cellos over chaos. A final act of defiance or devotion no one could understand. There was no captain in that moment, no God. Only music, trembling as the sea began to take the stage. Some say they played "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Others say it was something more frantic, more broken. But when the stern lifted into the air and passengers clung to railings like insects on a burning tree, the music was still there, thin and fragile like the last breath of the dying. They did not panic. They did not run. They watched the water rise with eyes that already knew how cold it would be. And when it finally reached them, it swallowed the notes first, then the hands, then the mouths, then the men. The band was never found together. Some were recovered weeks later, bloated and frozen, with their instruments still strapped to their backs, as if they had drowned standing up. History calls them brave. But what kind of courage is it to face death not in silence, but in song? What did they know in those last minutes that made music the only answer? In a world that rewards survival, they chose a melody no one could record. Only remember. It echoed not just through the water, but into history itself. And long after the Titanic vanished beneath the waves, long after the lights were gone and the world forgot the names of the dead, people remembered the sound of men who knew they were going to die and chose to become the soundtrack of the end. The baker who floated drunk. He didn't beg, he didn't scream, he didn't even run. While over 1,000 souls clawed at railings, sobbing for lifeboats that never came, Charles Juggin, the ship's chief baker, went below deck, opened a cabinet, and started drinking like the world wasn't ending. It wasn't panic. It wasn't stupidity. It was cold, calm defiance, poured straight down his throat. The Titanic was groaning above him, steel splitting like ribs in a monster's mouth. But he stood there, swaying, gulping whiskey, as if fire could protect him from the ice that waited. When people begged him to save himself, he just nodded and took another drink. He helped women into boats, threw deck chairs into the sea for the drowning. And then he walked to the back of the ship, not because he had a plan, but because he knew the front was already gone. When the stern rose into the air, towering like a final monument to human arrogance, he held the rail, lit a cigarette with hands that barely shook, and waited. Not for rescue, not for a miracle, just for gravity to finish what the ocean had started. And when it did, when the Titanic cracked and the lights blinked out like dying stars, he stepped into the Atlantic like he was going for a swim. No scream, no splash, just a drunk man sliding into death's mouth with a shrug. But he didn't die. That's the part no one understands. While men around him froze in minutes, stiff as statues, Charles kept moving. Hours passed, not 20 minutes. Hours, in water that burned skin like knives. He paddled, he floated, he stayed alive. He said later the liquor kept him warm, that he felt no chill. But it wasn't just booze. It was something else. Madness, maybe. Or fate. When they found him, his hair was frosted white, his lips blue, but he was alive. More alive than anyone had a right to be. The sea had swallowed hundreds. It choked children and crushed mothers, but not him. He rode it, he defied it, and he floated out of hell with whiskey on his breath and frost in his beard, the last man the ocean couldn't explain. The passengers trapped by gates. They could see the stairs, but they couldn't reach them. Just 20 steps up, the world was dry, lit by lanterns and lined with lifeboats, still waiting to leave. But between them and salvation stood iron gates, tall, black, and locked tight. Third-class passengers weren't allowed to mix with first. That was the rule. That was the system. That was the cage they died inside. The crew said it was for order, for safety, for quarantine. But when the Iceberg split steel like butter and seawater poured into the lowest decks, like a screaming invisible army, those barriers became death sentences. Whole families ran to the gates, pounding them with fists, screaming in Irish, Italian, Hungarian, tongues the crew barely understood, and maybe didn't want to. Mothers lifted babies between the bars. Fathers shouted for keys. Some tried to climb. Some tried to dig. But the gates didn't open, not until it was too late. By then the water was thigh-high, black as oil and rising faster than anyone could breathe. Some men threw luggage at the hinges. Others used their shoulders like battering rams, skins splitting on rusted metal while children sobbed behind them, pressed to the cold floor. And above them, silence. Officers escorting fur-coated women to safety. Gentlemen lighting cigarettes. The music of the band drifting down through cracks in the floor like a lullaby for the damned. And still, the gates held, until finally, something snapped. Wood, or bone, or steel, or will. And a flood of bodies surged up the stairs, dripping, gasping, wild-eyed. But by then the boats were already swinging overboard, already lowering, already full. They arrived just in time to watch others leave. Just in time to see the sky from the deck before the water chased them there too. Later, officials would claim the gates weren't locked, that passengers simply didn't try hard enough. But the rusted metal still clings to the wreck like the last secret it refuses to release. And down there, far beneath the waves, the gates are still shut, still silent, still holding back the ghosts of those who died not for lack of courage, but for being born on the wrong side of a lock. The captain who chose to sink. He could have lived. That's what made it worse. He had the power, the authority, the chance. As captain of the most magnificent ship ever built, Edward John Smith had a cabin near the lifeboats, an escort if needed, and every reason to step off the Titanic alive. But he didn't. As the ship bled steel into the ocean and voices cracked against the sky, he didn't shout. He didn't run. He moved like a ghost through the chaos, calm, cold, already fading. Some say he gave orders to the end, standing straight while the decks tilted beneath his boots. Others say he wandered in silence, eyes hollow, repeating, "Be British, boys, be British," like a spell against terror. He refused a lifeboat, refused to push, refused to save himself. When someone offered him a seat, he turned away without a word. His ship was dying, and he would die with it. That was the myth. That was the legend. But what no one can agree on is how he went. Some say he leapt from the bridge as the bow went under, swallowed instantly in a rush of black water and shattered glass. Others say he was last seen waist-deep in the wheelhouse, hand on the helm, steering into nothing, staring down the Atlantic as if daring it to blink. And then there's the whisper that he was found floating near a child's corpse, arms spread wide like wings, as if he had changed his mind at the last second and tried to swim back to life. No body was ever recovered, no official ending written, just fragments, just silence, just the image of a man who had everything and gave it to the sea. Whether out of honor, guilt, pride, or shame, no one knows. But while other captains saved themselves, he disappeared into legend, leaving behind a wheel, a shattered ship, and the story of a choice that still echoes in every dark wave where leaders fail, and ghosts steer alone into the deep. The father who dressed as a woman. They said women and children first, over and over, like a prayer, like a rule that would save someone. But for hundreds of men, it was a death sentence spoken politely. He had a family, 2 children clutching his coat, a wife with bloodless lips, eyes flicking between the sea and the sky like both might swallow her first. They were told there was no room for him, just the wife, just the kids, not him. And in that moment, he didn't beg, he didn't argue, he disappeared. Minutes later, he returned. Same coat, same voice, but now, a scarf wrapped tight around his face, a bonnet pulled low, a borrowed shawl from a stranger too dead or kind to protest. The crewman looked at him, hesitated, a flicker of something, suspicion or mercy, but the line kept moving, and the family boarded, together, no questions, no orders, just the creak of the lifeboat rope as it dropped into the freezing abyss. He sat silently, eyes locked forward, jaw clenched tight to keep from shaking, not from cold, but fear. One wrong word, one wrong movement, and it was over. They say he didn't speak until the next morning, when the Carpathia pulled them aboard and the sun revealed what the stars had hidden. Others had tried the same. Men with wigs, veils, high-pitched voices broken by panic. Most were caught, pulled from the boats, laughed at, shamed. Some even jumped rather than be exposed. But he made it. He lived. He sat beside his children on the rescue ship, holding their hands with gloved fingers that trembled long after the sea was behind them. Was it cowardice? Or the purest kind of desperation? In a world that asked him to die with dignity, he chose to live with shame. And in doing so, saved the only thing that mattered to him. His children never knew. His wife never spoke of it. But for the rest of his life, whenever he looked in a mirror, he didn't see a man or a hero. He saw a scarf, a choice, a mask that death didn't question. The mistake that doomed the ship. It wasn't just the iceberg that killed the Titanic. It was a series of mistakes, small, silent, invisible, that threaded together like a noose tightening around a giant. The ship's captain pushed her to record speeds despite warnings from other vessels. Messages slipped through telegraphs ignored or misunderstood. The lookout had no binoculars, locked away in a forgotten cabin, leaving eyes strained and desperate in the cold night air. The hull was made of brittle steel, weakened by low temperatures, unable to withstand the jagged kiss of the iceberg that scraped along its side. Lifeboats were fewer than needed, and the crew was unprepared for panic or disobedience. When the iceberg loomed, alarms rang too late, orders tangled in confusion. Passengers believed the ship was unsinkable, and that belief became a death sentence. Some refused to board lifeboats, convinced the danger was exaggerated, while others were turned away to keep class distinctions intact. The wireless operators were overwhelmed with messages, focusing more on personal telegrams than urgent warnings. All of this unfolded beneath a sky so clear it was almost cruel. Stars sparkling above, while men and women below were thrust into darkness. Every mistake compounded the next, a chain reaction spiraling toward doom. And when the hull finally gave way, it wasn't just nature that claimed the Titanic, it was human error, hubris, and neglect, wrapped together in a perfect storm of tragedy. The iceberg was the final blow, but the real killer was the countless moments when warnings were ignored, rules broken, and fate left to chance. The Titanic didn't sink because it hit an iceberg. It sank because no one saw the iceberg coming soon enough to stop it. The children frozen together. They were too young to understand what was happening, and that might have been a mercy. They didn't panic like the adults. They didn't shout for lifeboats, or fight for coats, or search for names on a list. They just held hands. Two children, siblings, maybe strangers, no one's sure, pressed into the corner of a lifeboat deck, dressed in thin nightclothes, faces pink from the cold, lips trembling not with fear, but confusion. They had been separated from their parents in the chaos. Some say they wandered out of the lower decks alone. Others say a stranger carried them above before vanishing into the sea. But when the last boats began to leave, no one claimed them. No names, no cries. Just two silent little shadows, too quiet to notice, too still to matter. The officers didn't know what to do. The boats were full, or nearly, and no one wanted to delay. So someone wrapped them in a coat and placed them side by side on the floor of lifeboat number 4, beneath benches already soaked in seawater and blood. They never cried. They never slept. Just sat, curled into each other like they'd done it 1,000 times, as the Titanic cracked and groaned behind them like a dying beast. When the rescue ship Carpathia arrived hours later, the crew found them still there, unmoving, arms locked, heads resting on each other's shoulders, frozen. Not from death alone, but from the kind of cold that turns skin to stone and silence to eternity. No one knew who they were. No one stepped forward to claim them. For weeks, they were simply listed as the unknown boys. A photograph was taken, 2 pale faces under wool, and printed in newspapers with captions that begged for answers. Finally, a mother came forward. A woman who had given them up for safety, never knowing they were never saved. She buried them together as they were found. No graves of stone, just one shared plot, one shared end. And in a tragedy measured in numbers, screams, and statistics, they became something different. A moment caught between life and death. 2 children who never let go, even when the sea turned their breath to frost and their names to whispers. The lights that flickered before death. At first, they gave hope. As passengers stumbled across the freezing deck, gripping railings slick with salt and panic, the Titanic's electric lights still glowed. A golden illusion in the jaws of death. Chandelier dining rooms, warm-lit corridors. The grand staircase still shone like it was expecting dancers, not drowning. People whispered that if the lights were on, the ship couldn't sink. That was the lie they told themselves as the floor tilted and walls began to groan. Below deck, engineers fought a war they could never win, shoveling coal into dying furnaces, rerouting pressure, bracing doors that burst like lungs underwater. They knew they'd never leave. They knew it before the first scream rose through the pipes. But they stayed, held the line, kept the generators alive, even as their boots floated off the floor and their hands blistered against boiling pipes. The light bought time. It calmed passengers just enough to lower boats, just enough to stop madness from taking over. But the sea was patient. It crept into the engine rooms, swallowing switches, chewing through wires, rising like a dark thought behind every flame. And then, at 2:18 a.m., it touched the heart of the ship. The lights flickered. Once, twice, a stutter, like a dying breath. And then darkness. All of it. Gone. The stars above were sharp and merciless, but below there was only black. Screams turned wild. The ship groaned like it was weeping, and in that pitch void, people tripped, fell, vanished. Mothers reached for children and found nothing. Men clutched lifebelts they couldn't see. 1 second earlier, the Titanic was a palace. 1 second later, it was a grave. When the stern rose into the air, the shadows stretched endlessly, broken only by sparks raining from the exposed belly. Silent fireworks for no one. Survivors would later say the lights going out was the worst moment of all. Not the cold, not the screams, but that flicker, that final blink of hope, snuffed out by salt and silence, as if the ship itself had finally accepted that it was never meant to survive. Trapped below decks in pure blackness, deep within the Titanic's bowels, far from the glittering dining rooms and frantic decks, lay the cramped, claustrophobic spaces below the waterline, the cold, dark compartments where many found themselves trapped as the ship sank. Imagine the terror, metal groaning and twisting as steel plates wrench apart, the deafening roar of water rushing in faster than lungs can gasp. The darkness is absolute. No light, no stars, only blackness pressing in from every side. The air grows thick, wet, and heavy with cold, every breath a struggle as water climbs relentlessly upward, swallowing space and hope. Seconds stretch into agonizing hours as time loses meaning. The trapped here screams above, muffled and distant. Then silence. Silence so deep it screams back. Panic fights with the creeping chill, and the mind races to grasp the impossible, the unimaginable. That escape may never come. Many who found themselves there held hands, whispered prayers, or simply waited. Waiting for what? They did not know. The water rises, swallowing everything familiar, until only darkness and cold remain. Those who died there vanished without trace, their bodies lost to the sea, their last moments forever trapped in a black, silent prison beneath the waves. It was a place of finality, a cold, merciless grave far from the world above, where seconds stretched into eternity and the light of life was extinguished in unending night. The iceberg that wasn't watched. It wasn't hiding. It wasn't a ghost or a phantom or a trick of the sea. It was just there, massive, jagged, ancient, drifting through the Atlantic like a cold monument to everything mankind couldn't control. And still, no one saw it in time. The night was too calm, the water like glass, reflecting the stars so clearly that waves disappeared. Without waves, there was no foam at the iceberg's base, no warning, just silence. The Titanic had lookouts, but no binoculars. They'd been locked away, accidentally, left behind with a crewman who never boarded. So the men in the crow's nest scanned the horizon with bare eyes, blinking into wind so sharp it peeled skin. They laughed, talked, stared into the nothing, and then one of them saw it. 11:39 p.m. A shape, a shadow, a death sentence gliding straight ahead. He rang the bell 3 times. Iceberg, right ahead. The warning crackled through the ship, shattering comfort like glass. The helmsman turned the wheel hard. The engines reversed. But it was too late. The iceberg scraped along the hull, not a crash, but a whisper, a sound like paper tearing underwater. Above deck, most felt nothing. A soft lurch, a shiver in the floorboards. Below deck, the sea came in like a secret, ripping open the first 5 compartments with the precision of a surgeon. Cold, precise, final. It was never about speed, never about arrogance alone. It was about what they didn't see, what they dismissed. A wall of ice, older than memory, floating silently, while a ship full of laughter and music bore down on it, like destiny couldn't bend. The iceberg didn't move, didn't break. It let the Titanic come to it, as if it had been waiting. And in the hours that followed, as lights flickered out and bodies fell into water colder than death, it continued drifting, unchanged, untouched. A reminder that sometimes, what kills you isn't the thing you hit. It's the thing you saw too late, through eyes that didn't believe the end could look so quiet. The musician who kept playing. He knew he was going to die. There was no misunderstanding, no hidden hope. The deck was slanted. The lifeboats were nearly gone. The sea had crept higher than anyone ever imagined. And still, he held his violin. Wallace Hartley, the bandleader, wasn't ordered to play. No one demanded a soundtrack for a disaster. But as passengers pushed past each other, as women sobbed and men lied to their children about everything being fine, he raised his bow. 1 note, then another. The others followed. Cello, bass, piano. Together they carved music into the chaos like it could stitch the world back together. People paused, turned, watched. Some said they played nearer, my God, to thee. Others swore it was something else, something sadder. A song without words, meant only for the dying. They didn't stop, even as the cold wrapped around their hands, even as water rushed across the deck like broken glass. One by one, the band fell away, fingers numb, instruments slipping. The pianist was the first to disappear, swept away mid-chord. Then the cellist, then the clarinet. But Wallace kept playing. He stood alone near the grand staircase, water now licking his shoes, as if melody could anchor him to life for just one more minute. His violin was a gift from his fiancée, engraved, loved. He played it like it was his last voice. And when the final note rang out, thin and trembling into the night, it was not followed by applause, but by silence, thick and brutal, as the sea rose to steal it. His body was found 2 weeks later, frozen, still in uniform, his violin case strapped to his chest. Salt-crusted fingers curled like he was still reaching for one last chord. They say bravery is charging into battle, but sometimes it's just standing still, making something beautiful while the world burns around you. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He gave the dying their final hymn, and in doing so, became more than a man with a violin. He became the sound the sea couldn't drown. The girl buried in ice. She was only 4, too small to understand the screams, too young to process the thunder of steel tearing apart below her feet. Her mother wrapped her in a shawl, kissed her forehead, and whispered a promise she couldn't keep. "I'll see you soon." Then she lifted the child into a stranger's arms, handed over her world, and stepped back into the panic. No name, no ticket. Just a girl with wide eyes and a doll clutched in one hand, bundled tight as if fabric could protect her from the cold waiting outside. The stranger made it to a lifeboat. The girl was lowered down, sobbing for a mother she couldn't see anymore. But the boat didn't fill. It drifted, silent, shivering. Hours passed. The screams behind them faded. The stars sharpened like knives in the sky. And the child, still wrapped, still silent, curled up beneath the bench, pressing her face into the folds of someone's coat. By the time the rescue ship arrived, she wasn't moving. Her lips were blue, her skin the color of frost. Her doll had fallen into the sea, and no one on the boat knew her name. She was listed simply as the unknown French girl. A photo was taken, a tiny body wrapped in blankets, frozen in sleep that would never break. The image spread across newspapers like a curse, asking the world to speak her name back into existence. And finally, after weeks of searching, someone answered. Her father. He came to claim her, carrying the truth like a weight on his chest. Her name was Lorraine. She had been born laughing. She had liked horses. And she had never seen snow until the night the ocean gave her a grave made of ice. She was buried in Halifax, Canada, where the headstone still stands. A tiny cross, a single word, Lorraine, and beneath it, silence. No songs, no last words. Just the memory of a child swallowed by cold because her name wasn't on the right list. Her mother trusted a stranger, and the sea never asks how old you are before it calls you home. The officer who shot himself, he was supposed to keep order. That was the job. When the ship began to list and the steel cried out beneath the sea's pull, First Officer William Murdoch stood at his post, revolver holstered, hat low, voice sharp. He was the one who lowered lifeboats, the one who shouted, "Women and children only," as men crowded forward with desperation swelling in their throats. For a time, he held the chaos back. For a time, his voice was louder than the panic. But panic, like water, always finds the cracks. They surged, Passengers climbing over railings, pushing past mothers, gripping ropes with white-knuckled fists. Murdoch raised the gun. He fired once into the air. The crowd flinched, froze. Then one man lunged, another followed. And Murdoch did the unthinkable. He aimed. He pulled the trigger again. The man fell, blood splattering across the deck, vanishing into the darkness like it had never happened. The crowd backed away. Order for a moment returned, but something had broken. Not just in the ship, but in him. He looked down at the weapon, looked out at the water, then placed the barrel against his own temple, and pulled the trigger one last time. His body dropped instantly. Some say it fell into the sea. Others say crew members covered it in silence. But no official report confirmed what dozens saw. The White Star Line denied it, claimed he died like a hero, swept away by the waves. But the passengers knew. They remembered the sound, the sudden stop, the man who kept the line together until it tore him apart. Some called him a coward, others called it mercy. But in that moment, Murdoch became more than an officer. He became the cost of control. The proof that even those in charge can shatter under the weight of duty, guilt, and the unbearable truth that some things, no matter how hard you fight, cannot be saved. The baby, lost in the water. No one knew her name. She was just a tiny bundle, wrapped tight in a mother's trembling arms, a fragile, silent promise in a world gone mad. The Titanic was groaning, metal twisting like a dying beast, and chaos swallowed the decks whole. Mothers cried for lifeboats, fathers pushed through crowds, and somewhere between the screams and splintering wood, the baby slipped free, silent, unseen, falling into the cold black Atlantic like a feather caught in a storm's cruel breath. The water was merciless, colder than any body could survive, wrapping her in icy hands that crushed without cruelty, slow and absolute. Lifeboats drifted nearby, voices shouted orders and prayers, ropes creaked under hurried hands, but no one saw the tiny face breaking the surface. No one reached down to catch her. The hours passed like frozen centuries. The cold stole breath and hope alike, while the sea whispered lullabies no child should ever hear, dark and endless. When the rescue ship Carpathia finally arrived, they found her, a small, lifeless body tangled in driftwood, eyes wide open, staring not at the stars, but at a world that had already turned its back. She was buried in Halifax, her grave marked simply with the words, "Unknown Child." Sailors whispered her name in the night, calling her the baby who never knew warmth, whose last breath was swallowed by ice and silence. She became a ghost, a symbol of innocence lost and forgotten, a haunting reminder that sometimes the sea keeps its darkest secrets well, and the smallest souls slip through history's cracks, remembered only by the cold waves that carry their silence forever. The pet that was locked below. Amid the panic and rush of passengers fleeing the sinking ship, one small life was forgotten, Tim, the ship's beloved terrier. Known to many aboard as a comforting presence, Tim wore a tiny life jacket and was often seen trotting happily across the decks, calming children and even grown men with his soft barks and wagging tail. But as the Titanic began to tilt and the cold black water crept in like a living thing, Tim's fate became cruelly sealed. His owners, desperate to save themselves and their families, had no choice but to leave him behind, locked in a kennel deep below the decks, where darkness swallowed sound and water rose relentlessly. Through the steel walls, faint barks echoed, a lonely plea muffled beneath the chaos overhead. Lifeboats were lowered, cries rang out, and the screams of hundreds filled the night. But Tim paddled in darkness, trapped and confused, unable to understand why the doors never opened. The crew was overwhelmed, the sea was ruthless. And as the great ship vanished beneath the waves, so too did the small dog, swallowed by cold and silence. Survivors spoke of him in whispers, a symbol of all the innocent left behind. the quiet lives lost in a tragedy measured by human faces alone. Tim's story is not recorded in official logs or memorials. It lives in the shadows between the cries, a reminder that even amidst disaster, love is sometimes not enough to save the smallest among us, and that the sea takes all, man, woman, child, and dog, without mercy or distinction. The final note played on deck. As the Titanic shuddered and began its slow, deadly tilt into the freezing Atlantic, a haunting sound rose above the chaos, the fragile, trembling cry of a single violin. Wallace Hartley, the bandleader, had gathered his fellow musicians in the grand staircase's shadow, determined to play until the very end. For hours, their music sliced through the darkness and despair, weaving a thin thread of hope amid screams, cries, and the grinding steel of a ship breaking apart. Passengers clung to life, clutching each other as the icy water crept closer, but Hartley and his band played on. The notes floated across the decks, haunting and bittersweet, as if the music itself was a shield against the cold grip of death. Yet as the stern lifted higher and the sea swallowed compartments one by one, the band's melodies grew softer, more desperate. Each note a final prayer whispered against the inevitable. And then, as the ship's lights flickered and faded, Hartley lifted his bow for one last stroke. The final note lingered in the bitter air, trembling like a fragile heartbeat, holding all the sorrow, bravery, and broken dreams of those still clinging to hope. Survivors would later say that note echoed long after the screams had died away, piercing the endless black like a ghost's final farewell. Some believed it was a hymn, others a lament, but all agreed it was a defiant cry, a last stand of humanity against the merciless sea. When the ship finally disappeared beneath the waves, the band vanished with it, swallowed whole by the cold depths. But that final note, the one no ocean could drown, lives on. It echoes across time and memory, a ghostly melody that reminds us that even in the face of oblivion, there is beauty, there is courage, there is the sound of men who chose to make music in the darkest hour, playing not for survival, but for the souls they carried with them into the deep. The rope that was blessed for hanging, it was just a thick, heavy coil of rope, nothing unusual in the chaos of a massive ship preparing for voyage. But on the Titanic, that rope carried a darker tale, whispered in corners and carried on cold drafts through the decks. Before the ship had even left Southampton, rumours began to swirl among the crew, an old sailor's curse that this particular rope had been blessed by a priest, not for salvation, but for death, meant for hangings, for punishment, for keeping order when chaos ruled. It was said the rope had once been used in executions, soaked with the weight of despair and finality. Some crewmen laughed it off as superstition, a sailor's myth to pass the time. Others felt a chill whenever they saw the rope coiled in the cargo hold, as if it held a hunger, waiting patiently beneath the shadows. When the iceberg struck and the Titanic began its slow, desperate descent into the cold ocean, the rope remained hidden, but it took on a sinister life of its own in the minds of those aboard. There were stories. A sailor trying to tie down a man driven mad by fear, only to find the rope slipping like it had a will of its own. Others spoke of officers clutching it tightly as a weapon against rebellion, a grim reminder that law would be maintained, even as everything else fell apart. As the ship's lights flickered and drowned in the blackness, the rope's legend grew. Survivors later said that on the decks, in the dead moments between panic and despair, they heard creaks and whispers, like the rope was tightening itself, binding the souls of the doomed. No trace of that rope was ever recovered after the wreck. Some say it lies tangled in the ocean's dark embrace, a cursed coil waiting for a neck to tighten around. A chilling reminder that even when men vanish, the instruments of fear and death endure. The rope story is not just about punishment, but about control, desperation, and how power clings to the last threads of order, even when the world sinks beneath the waves. the eye surgery done with urine. Medical care aboard the Titanic was a mix of cutting-edge and desperate improvisation, but nothing was as horrifying as the eye surgery performed in the cramped infirmary during the sinking. One passenger suffered a painful eye injury, a shard of glass or splinter, the exact cause lost to history, and with the ship filling rapidly around them, doctors had no choice but to act. They lacked sterile water or proper antiseptics, so they resorted to the only available fluid, urine. Known at the time for its supposed cleansing properties, urine was poured carefully into the wounded eye as a makeshift sterilizer. The patient's screams mingled with the groans of the ship, each sting a brutal reminder that medicine in the face of death was no mercy but agony. The doctors worked frantically in dim light, their hands trembling not just from cold, but the impossible task of saving life as the sea swallowed their world. The surgery was a desperate gamble, painful, unsanitary, and terrifying. Many would never know if it helped or hastened death, but in those final moments, survival meant enduring horrors beyond the sinking itself. When the ship finally sank, the infirmary was lost beneath the waves, taking with it the secrets of suffering, desperation, and the cruel lengths to which humans will go when trapped between life and oblivion. The saint's finger sold for gold. In the glittering opulence of the Titanic's first-class cabins, where crystal chandeliers cast rainbows on polished wood and silk gowns whispered secrets, faith traveled silently alongside wealth and status. Among the treasures carried by the ship's richest passengers was a relic of unusual power and mystery, a preserved finger of a saint, carefully wrapped in fine cloth and encased in gold, believed to hold blessings that could protect its bearer from harm. This relic was more than a token of devotion. It was a symbol of hope and salvation, a physical link to the divine in a world poised on the brink of disaster. Rumors swirled quietly through the lavish suites and hushed corridors. The saint's finger was not just sacred, but priceless, a treasure that could fetch an unimaginable fortune if sold to the right buyer. When the Iceberg tore into the Titanic's hull and the sinking began in earnest, desperation seeped into even the grandest rooms. Stories emerged of frantic negotiations, whispered exchanges where the relic was offered as currency, an ultimate bargain struck with fate itself. Some say the finger was slipped into the hands of a lifeboat crewman in exchange for safe passage, a secret deal cloaked beneath panic and greed. Others believe it vanished beneath the waves, lost to the cold, dark ocean that swallowed the ship whole. Yet some survivors swore they saw it hidden away on rescue ships, guarded jealously by its owner, who clung to both faith and fortune in equal measure. The chilling reality of sacred bones traded like gold in the shadow of death unsettled even the most devout believers. It revealed a world where faith and avarice danced dangerously close, where salvation might be bought or lost with the flick of a coin. The saint's finger became more than a relic. It became a symbol of human desperation, a haunting emblem of the priceless things we clutch when the end draws near, and the dark bargains we are willing to make when survival hangs in the balance. The baby who never had a name. She was born amid chaos, a fragile breath in a world collapsing beneath the weight of fate. The Titanic's third-class quarters, cramped and cold, became her first home, a place where hope was scarce and fear hung thick like fog. Her mother, pale and trembling, whispered promises of safety and warmth she could not guarantee, her voice a fragile thread against the growing roar of panic. The baby never heard a name. There was no lullaby, no tender embrace that could shield her from the cold night to come. Wrapped hastily in a threadbare blanket, she was carried through the madness onto the deck, where the wind bit through clothes and the sea seemed to reach for every living thing. Lifeboats were lowered, filled to bursting with women and children, but in the rush and terror, the baby slipped from her mother's grasp, vanishing into the cold embrace of the Atlantic. No one saw her fall, no one reached for her. Hours later, when the rescue ship Carpathia gathered survivors, she was not among them. No cries, no whispers, no mark of her passing remained. She was recorded only as unnamed, a ghost lost in the ocean's endless silence. Her grave was the sea itself, cold and vast, where countless others disappeared without record or ceremony. Historians later pieced together whispers and fragments, but her story remains a shadow, a silent testament to the lives erased before they even began. In the Titanic's grand tale of tragedy and heroism, she stands as a haunting symbol of innocence lost, a reminder that amid history's great events, the smallest voices are often the ones most easily forgotten. The bloodletting that killed kings. On the Titanic, modern luxury masked a world still gripped by old and deadly medical practices. Among the passengers was a nobleman, suffering from a lingering illness, who placed his trust not in the ship's doctors, but in a remedy centuries old: bloodletting. Believing that draining the body of bad blood would restore health, physicians aboard used sharp instruments to pierce veins and release precious life in hopes of a cure. But the practice was brutal and unsanitary, especially in the cramped, freezing infirmary, where the sinking ship made care nearly impossible. As the water rose and chaos claimed the decks, the nobleman's condition worsened, his strength fading as blood poured out, unchecked and uncontrolled. The remedy meant to heal instead hastened his end, leaving him pale and weak as the ship slipped beneath the waves. His death was a quiet one amid the storm, overshadowed by louder screams and frantic orders, yet it spoke volumes about a time when medicine was as much a risk as the disaster itself. The bloodletting was not just a medical failure, but a grim symbol of human vulnerability, caught between hope and hubris, between science and superstition, and ultimately between life and death on a ship doomed from the start. The child buried with rats. Deep within the shadowed bowels of the Titanic, far from the glittering halls and frantic decks, lay a grim and lonely tomb, a cramped, forgotten space where a child's tiny body was laid to rest, without ceremony or comfort. This was no place for mourning. It was a cold, shadowed corner where the light dared not linger, and where the creeping presence of rats scuttled freely among the forgotten. The child had succumbed long before the Iceberg's fatal strike, perhaps to illness, injury, or despair, a quiet casualty of a voyage that would soon become one of history's greatest tragedies. The lower decks, crowded with cargo, coal, and shadows, were known to harbour vermin and filth, and the child's body became a silent feast for rats drawn to the warmth of a life ended too soon. Crew members whispered in hushed tones of what they saw. Tiny hands curled as if dreaming, skin pale beneath threadbare cloth, and the faint, cruel marks of bites and scratches that told of nature's merciless indifference even amidst human sorrow. As the ship groaned and filled with icy water, the child remained hidden in that grim enclosure, the rats moving in and out like ghosts among the dead. When the Titanic finally slipped beneath the waves, the body sank with it, swallowed by the Atlantic's cold, dark depths, and the rats scattered into the night, leaving behind only echoes of a life erased. This nameless child became a haunting symbol, not of heroism or tragedy shouted from the decks, but of the countless forgotten souls lost in the margins of history, perishing unnoticed, unmourned, and swallowed by shadows while the world above fought to survive. The nun who was bricked alive. Among the Titanic's many passengers was Sister Mary, a young nun bound for America to serve in a distant convent. Known for her gentle spirit and quiet devotion, she moved through the grand halls like a beacon of calm amid the chaos and luxury. But behind her serene exterior lay a haunting shadow, whispers tied to an ancient and terrible punishment once meted out to women of faith accused of betrayal or heresy, being bricked alive. In medieval times, such women were sealed within cold, narrow walls, left to perish in utter darkness and silence, a slow and torturous death that became a whispered nightmare through the ages. Though Sister Mary carried nothing but faith and hope aboard the Titanic, rumors clung to her like a second skin, hushed stories told in fearful glances and nervous whispers among passengers and crew. As the ship began its slow, desperate descent into the icy Atlantic, some said they saw her retreat into the shadowed lower decks, disappearing into corridors that twisted like catacombs beneath the grand ship. Others remembered her kneeling in quiet prayer, hands folded tightly, eyes shut against the terror swelling around her, as if preparing to face an unimaginable fate. She never boarded a lifeboat. The sea claimed her, swallowing her into its cold, endless embrace, a final tomb far more vast than any brick prison. Sister Mary's story became a ghostly legend whispered long after the disaster. A nun whose fate echoed the darkest chapters of history, sealed not by mortar, but by water, lost between faith and oblivion. Her silent suffering, her unknown last moments, linger as a chilling reminder that sometimes the cruelties of the past find new life even amidst the horrors of the present, and that the sea does not distinguish between punishment and salvation. It takes all alike, without mercy or judgment. The fire that was burning before the ice. Long before the Titanic's fateful collision with the Iceberg, a hidden disaster was already quietly consuming the ship from within. Deep in the bowels of the great vessel, a coal fire had been burning for weeks, smouldering unnoticed beneath layers of coal stored for the ship's engines. The flames were slow and relentless, licking at the walls of the storage bunkers, warping steel beams and weakening the very iron that was supposed to protect thousands from the ocean's deadly embrace. The crew knew about the fire, but their efforts to control it were limited and desperate, shoveling fresh coal atop the burning embers, trying to starve the flames of oxygen even as the fire burrowed deeper into the ship's core. No passenger had the faintest idea that beneath their feet, the Titanic was being eaten alive by heat and smoke. Only whispered rumors among the crew hinted at the danger lurking in the darkness below. When the Iceberg tore into the hull, the damage was far worse than anyone imagined, not just from the cold steel shearing, but from the fire-weakened metal that gave way more easily, allowing the icy water to pour in faster and flood compartments with merciless speed. The fire was a secret enemy, a slow and insidious poison that sapped the ship's strength, turning the night of the sinking into a perfect storm of fire and ice. As the great ship slipped beneath the waves, the fire's last embers were swallowed by the cold Atlantic, leaving behind only charred memories beneath the sea. This hidden blaze, invisible to the world above, was a grim reminder that sometimes disaster comes not from a single moment, but from quiet destruction, patiently unraveling the strongest foundations long before the final collapse. The people who were sucked into the ship. When the Titanic struck the Iceberg, the damage was catastrophic, and not just from the water flooding in. The collision tore gaping holes in the ship's hull, including one beneath the first funnel and others in the deck houses above, creating terrifying vortexes where air, water, and steel violently collided. These breaches became deadly traps, sucking people into the ship's hollowed, flooded interior with a force impossible to resist. Witnesses on deck recalled the horrific sounds, the roar of rushing water mingling with desperate screams, muffled yet chilling, swallowed quickly by the chaos. Men and women standing near the damaged areas were yanked by invisible currents, their bodies pulled toward the yawning holes as if the ship itself were consuming them. Some were dragged through narrow vents and shafts, twisted between steel plates and shattered beams, disappearing into the cold, dark depths below, with no chance of escape. Children clung to parents, but even the strongest were helpless against the power of the rushing water and collapsing structure. Survivors described watching friends and strangers vanish in moments, caught by currents so fierce they were torn from the surface and dragged into the ship's belly, never to be seen again. The decks trembled beneath feet as the hull groaned and twisted, and the unforgiving Atlantic pressed relentlessly against every crack and seam. For those left clinging to lifeboats or railings, the horror of witnessing loved ones and strangers alike sucked into the ship's maw became one of the most haunting memories of that night. It was a brutal reminder that the Titanic's destruction was not only slow and inevitable, but violent and merciless, claiming lives in ways no one could have imagined, swallowed whole by the very ship they had trusted to carry them safely across the sea. 4 hours in the freezing North Atlantic. Imagine sitting in a small lifeboat, surrounded by endless black water under a starless sky, the bitter cold cutting through every layer of clothing like sharp knives. The air is heavy and still, but your body is trembling uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from the crushing weight of uncertainty. Hours stretch endlessly as you stare into the void, wondering if rescue will ever come, or if the sea will claim you like so many before. Your hands numb, your teeth chattering, every breath feels like it might be your last. Around you, other survivors cling to whatever hope remains, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The silence is broken only by the distant splash of water and the occasional moan of the wind. Time loses all meaning. The minutes bleed into hours, each one a lifetime in itself. You think of loved ones, of life left behind, and wonder if you'll ever see them again. The cold is relentless, sapping strength, stealing warmth, pushing you closer to surrender. Yet somehow, you hold on, anchored by a fragile thread of hope. And when the distant lights of the rescue ship finally break the darkness, you feel a surge of relief so intense it threatens to shatter your frozen body. Those 4 hours, suspended between life and death, become a crucible of human endurance, a testament to the will to survive against all odds in the merciless grip of the North Atlantic. Sitting in a lifeboat in the dark, hearing the screams die out. The night stretched endless and black, an abyss surrounding a small lifeboat rocking gently on the merciless Atlantic. Inside, survivors huddled together, their faces pale and etched with exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. Above, the sky offered no comfort, no stars, no moon, just a void as empty as their hope. For hours, the only sounds were the creaking of wood and the soft splash of waves against the hull, broken intermittently by the raw, desperate screams rising from the freezing water and the sinking ship. Those screams were not just noises. They were the last cries of souls caught between life and death, a terrifying symphony of panic, pain, and loss. Slowly, agonizingly, the cries began to fade. First a few voices lost, then whole groups swallowed by silence. The cold water swallowed more than bodies that night. It swallowed sound, hope, and life itself. Each dying scream was a nail hammered into the coffin of hope, a haunting reminder that rescue might come too late for many. Some survivors covered their ears, trembling, unable to bear the sound. Others sat frozen, wide-eyed and silent, watching the blackness close in, feeling the heavy weight of despair settle over them like a shroud. The silence that replaced the screams was no relief. It was a vast, suffocating void, pressing down on their souls, isolating them in a world without light or sound. In that tiny boat, adrift in an endless sea of darkness and death, they understood the cruelest truth of all. The screams they heard were the last cries of humanity's desperate fight. And when those voices finally died, so too did the world they knew. The silence was the sound of the ocean's cold, unyielding finality, a chilling reminder that sometimes survival means bearing witness to the dying, alone and adrift in the dark. John Jacob Astor, the millionaire lost to the sea. John Jacob Astor IV was more than just a passenger on the Titanic. He was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men aboard, a symbol of America's Gilded Age, wrapped in finely tailored clothes and dripping with influence. At 47, Astor had built an empire from real estate and invention, marrying a young, beautiful wife, and expecting a child who would carry on his legacy. As the Titanic's decks glittered with champagne and music, he moved through the first-class cabins with quiet confidence, seemingly untouchable amid the opulence and splendor. But when the iceberg struck, that veneer of control shattered instantly. Astor helped his pregnant wife, Madeleine, into one of the lifeboats, whispering promises that he would join her soon, his voice steady despite the chaos. Refusing early offers to board, he chose instead to stay behind on the sinking ship, walking the decks with a calm resolve, a man facing the inevitable with dignity. Survivors last saw him standing near the grand staircase, his gaze steady as the ship's stern lifted high into the freezing air. But then, like so many others, he was swallowed by the cold Atlantic, disappearing beneath the waves, along with the dreams and fortunes he carried. Weeks later, his body was recovered far from the wreck, dressed impeccably even in death, a stark reminder that no wealth or power could protect him from nature's cruel hand. Astor's passing became a symbol of the fragility of life and fortune, a haunting testament that in that night of terror, even the richest man was just another soul lost to the merciless sea, leaving behind a legacy forever entwined with tragedy and loss. The last survivor's legacy. No one who lived through the Titanic's tragic night remains alive today. The final chapter of living memory closed when Milvina Dean passed away quietly in 2009 at the age of 97. Born just 2 months before the ship's fateful voyage, Milvina was the last survivor of the Titanic's youngest passenger aboard, saved only because her mother and brother secured places on Lifeboat 13. Her father, like many others, was lost forever to the icy Atlantic's unforgiving grasp. Before Milvina, the last survivor with a conscious memory of the disaster was Lillian Asplund, who was just 5 years old when the Titanic slipped beneath the waves and who lived until 2006. Together, these last survivors represented the final living links to one of history's most infamous maritime tragedies. With their passing, the human voices and first-hand memories faded into silence, leaving behind only photographs, letters, and stories recorded in history books and films. Yet their legacy endures, a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of human resilience. Though time claims all who witnessed that cold night, the lessons, warnings, and memories they carried continue to ripple through generations, ensuring the Titanic's story remains alive, not just as a tale of tragedy, but as a testament to survival, sacrifice, and the enduring spirit of humanity amidst unimaginable loss. The oil that coated the living. As the Titanic's majestic form slipped beneath the icy Atlantic, survivors faced horrors that went far beyond the bitter cold and crushing depths. Among the many invisible killers that night was the thick, black oil that seeped from the ship's ruptured boilers and fuel tanks, spreading like a suffocating shroud across the surface of the freezing water. This slick was no mere nuisance. It clung to skin, clothing, and hair with a relentless grip, turning every desperate movement into a struggle against an unseen enemy. Men and women clutching to pieces of wreckage found themselves weighed down by the viscous grime, their limbs slowing as the oily substance coated them, sapping strength and hope with every passing minute. The oil seeped into open wounds, burning like fire and adding agonizing pain to the already unbearable cold. It clogged mouths and noses, making each breath a gasp against choking suffocation. In the pale glow of the moon, the oily sheen cast a haunting reflection, a cruel, shimmering layer over the water that concealed the tragedy beneath. Survivors later spoke of the nightmare of battling not just hypothermia and drowning, but this toxic flood, fighting to keep their heads above water thickened by poison. The oil turned the Atlantic from an enemy into a chemical trap, swallowing warmth and life in equal measure. For many, it was this deadly coating, this black, choking weight, that tipped the scales between life and death dragging bodies silently into the abyss. Often overlooked in tales of the Titanic's sinking, the oil remains a grim testament to the layers of suffering endured that night. Proof that the sea's cruelty was not only in its cold and depth, but in the deadly remnants of human industry sinking alongside the dreams of all who sailed. The forgotten third-class children. While the Titanic's tragedy is often remembered through the lens of its wealthy first-class passengers and heroic crew, a silent and heartbreaking story lies buried beneath. The fate of the hundreds of third-class children aboard. Many of these children travelled either alone or with distant family members, far from the familiar safety of home. Unlike their wealthier counterparts, they were confined to the ship's lower decks, separated by locked gates and strict class divisions that made escape nearly impossible when disaster struck. When the Iceberg tore into the hull, chaos erupted across the ship, but the barriers meant to enforce social order became deadly traps. The third-class children found themselves trapped behind heavy gates, locked to prevent mingling with first-class passengers. Panic swept through the cramped corridors and cabins, but there was no room to run, no lifeboats waiting for them at the ready. Many were separated from guardians or traveling without adult supervision, left vulnerable to drowning in the rising waters or succumbing to cold and fear. Unlike the first-class children, who were often prioritized for evacuation and protection, these young souls were forgotten amid the turmoil. The official records of survivors and victims scarcely capture their names, many recorded simply as unknown, buried in unmarked graves far from the remembrance ceremonies and memorials that honored others. Their voices, cries, and faces were swallowed by the cold sea and lost to the silence of history. The forgotten third-class children remain a haunting symbol of the Titanic's darkest injustice, a stark reminder that survival was often a matter of social status. While luxury liners promised dreams of a new life, for many of these children, the journey ended in tragedy and anonymity, their stories erased by locked doors, cruel fate, and the unforgiving cold that claimed them. Their memory lingers as a solemn testament to lives overlooked and the profound human cost hidden beneath the Titanic's grandeur. The lifeboat, filled with rats. As the Titanic began to sink and lifeboats were hurriedly lowered into the freezing Atlantic, one particular boat, Lifeboat 12, became the scene of a horrifying ordeal beyond the terror of the sinking itself. The ship's lower decks, especially the cargo and storage areas, were infested with rats, drawn by the warmth and the stores of food and materials. When the lifeboats were launched amid the chaos and panic, some of these swarms of rats were inadvertently scooped up along with the desperate passengers escaping the doomed ship. Survivors in Lifeboat 12 later described an unimaginable nightmare, rats crawling over their bodies, biting and scratching in the darkness of the small boat. The vermin were relentless, drawn by hunger and fear, adding an unbearable layer of terror to an already desperate fight for survival. The rats clung to clothing, bit exposed skin, and caused panic among those trying to stay calm in the cold night. For many, the presence of these pests was almost as terrifying as the icy sea around them. This grim infestation followed the survivors into the cold ocean night, a haunting reminder of the filth and decay lurking beneath the Titanic's gleaming exterior. While the ship's grand ballrooms and first-class cabins had dazzled with luxury, beneath the surface, the reality was much darker. The rats were a living symbol of the hidden dangers aboard the ship, dangers that no amount of wealth or status could protect passengers from. For those trapped in Lifeboat 12, the rats became a cruel and unrelenting enemy, forcing survivors to fight not just for life against the cold and waves, but for every inch of safety from the tiny, gnawing creatures. This horrifying detail is often overlooked in tales of the Titanic's sinking, but it stands as a stark reminder that in disaster, horror comes in many forms, seen and unseen, and that sometimes the smallest threats can be the most terrifying of all. The musician who lost his instrument. While the Titanic's band is famously remembered for their unwavering commitment to play music until the very end, not all musicians aboard shared stories of heroic final notes filled with grandeur. Among them was a violinist whose personal tale carried a tragic loss beyond the sinking itself, the loss of his cherished instrument. As the ship listed dangerously and panic surged through the decks, the violinist clutched his beloved violin close, but in the chaos and crushing crowds, his instrument was swept away, falling into the freezing Atlantic waters, swallowed quickly by the cold black waves. Witnesses who survived recalled the haunting image of the musician continuing to play, borrowing another violin from a fellow bandmate, his melodies now broken and fragmented, fragile as a ghost's last breath. His music drifted over the decks like a fragile thread, cutting through screams and despair, a haunting soundtrack to a fading world. Beneath the ocean, amid the wreckage, his lost violin rests silent, a submerged relic of artistry and life violently torn apart. The story of this musician stands not only as a testament to courage and sacrifice amid disaster, but also as a poignant symbol of fragile beauty destroyed that night, forever lost beneath the relentless sea. His music, silenced physically but immortalized in memory, echoes through history as a ghostly reminder of art and humanity, slipping away beneath waves that swallow everything indiscriminately. The officer who ordered passengers off. Lieutenant Charles Lightoller, the Titanic's second officer and the most senior crew member to survive, played a pivotal and controversial role during the ship's final hours. Known for his strict, no-nonsense demeanor, Lightoller took charge of loading lifeboats with unwavering commitment to the protocol of women and children first. His stern enforcement of this rule meant that countless men were forced to remain on the sinking ship, watching helplessly as the lifeboats were lowered without them, their desperate pleas falling on deaf ears. Passengers begged for exceptions, fathers wanting to stay with their children, husbands refusing to leave their wives alone. But Lightoller refused to bend the rules, convinced that maintaining order was the only hope in the chaos. This cold rigidity saved many lives, but it also condemned hundreds to a watery grave, a grim calculus made under impossible pressure. Lightoller believed that strict discipline was essential to prevent panic and chaos, but his decisions sparked bitter debate among survivors and historians alike. Some hailed him as a hero who kept the evacuation from descending into anarchy. Others saw him as a figure of cold cruelty, embodying the harsh social divisions and gender roles that shaped who lived and who died. His role highlights a tragic truth about disaster, that survival is often determined not just by chance, but by decisions made in moments of extreme pressure, where morality and necessity clash violently. Lightoller's legacy is a haunting example of how discipline and survival often conflict, and how the line between heroism and harshness can blur when lives hang in the balance. The man who enforced order that night shaped the fate of many, embodying both the noblest ideals and the cruelest realities of humanity under duress. His story reminds us that in tragedy, decisions can save lives and condemn them simultaneously, leaving echoes of pain and debate long after the last lifeboat has drifted away. The harsh reality of Lifeboat 1. Lifeboat 1, often overshadowed by tales of heroism on the Titanic, carried a grim and controversial story of wasted opportunity and social division. Designed to hold up to 40 people, this lifeboat was lowered from the ship with only 12 souls aboard, less than a third of its capacity. The reasons for this drastic underfilling are tangled in a complex web of class, confusion, and fear. Among those who boarded early were a handful of first-class passengers and crew members who prioritized their survival, some even reluctant to take on additional passengers. The atmosphere was tense, with whispers of privilege and exclusivity, as some refused to allow third-class passengers or crew into the lifeboat, despite the remaining empty seats. The officers in charge, influenced by a mix of social hierarchy and a desire to maintain order, chose not to overload the lifeboat out of fear it might capsize. A fear not unfounded, but tragically misapplied, given the desperate need for evacuation. This decision left dozens, if not hundreds, of people to perish, while a lifeboat drifted away from the ship nearly half empty. Survivors and witnesses later recounted the haunting guilt and bitterness surrounding Lifeboat 1. It became a symbol of the Titanic's cruel social inequalities, how wealth and status could dictate who lived and who died, even in moments of universal crisis. The story of Lifeboat 1 forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature under pressure, how fear can exacerbate division, how social boundaries can become barriers to survival, and how decisions made in panic can have devastating consequences. For many, that underfilled lifeboat was not just a vessel of escape, but a stark reminder of lost chances and the tragic cost of privilege in the face of disaster. Its legacy remains a haunting echo of what might have been, a floating testament to the lives that could have been saved but were left behind. The ghost light in the wireless room. Amid the chaos and terror of the Titanic's final hours, strange and unsettling phenomena were reported from the ship's wireless room, an eerie place where desperation met technology in a desperate struggle to call for help. Crew members manning the Marconi wireless sets, tasked with sending distress signals, began noticing inexplicable flickering lights and ghostly noises that seemed to come from nowhere. As the ship's electrical systems faltered under the strain of flooding and damage, these strange flickers, some described as pulses of pale, unnatural light, danced across the equipment, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed almost alive. But it wasn't just the lights. Operators and nearby crew heard whispers and faint voices crackling through the static, messages that didn't match any known distress calls or transmissions. Some believed these were the spirits of those lost, desperately trying to send final warnings or connect with the living one last time. Others dismissed the phenomena as the dying groans of a failing ship's power system, electrical currents reacting unpredictably as circuits shorted and sparked. The wireless room was already a place of tension, where the relentless tap-tap-tap of Morse code competed with the thunderous sounds of flooding and screams. But the addition of these ghostly occurrences added an unsettling layer of the supernatural to the disaster. Survivors would recount these tales in later years, embellishing the mystery as time wove threads of legend into the stark reality. This ghost light became a symbol of the Titanic's tragic end, not just a ship sinking into the sea, but a vessel haunted by the souls of those it could not save. It serves as a chilling reminder that some messages from disaster are not just sent across airwaves, but linger in the spaces between life and death, where technology, fear, and the unknown collide in the darkest moments. The man who burned his own passport. Among the thousands of passengers aboard the Titanic was a man whose desperate act would condemn him to obscurity far beyond the tragedy of the sinking itself. This third-class traveller, burdened by the hardships of his past and the hopes of a new beginning, made a fateful decision before boarding. He burned his own passport, whether driven by fear of deportation, shame over his background, or a desire to completely sever ties with a life he wanted to forget. The reasons remain lost to history. But this act of erasing his official identity became a curse as cruel as any fate the icy sea might deliver. When the Titanic collided with the Iceberg and chaos erupted, rescue efforts and survivor lists depended heavily on identification papers. Without a passport or any documentation, this man became invisible to the bureaucracies and organizations tasked with recording those who survived and those who perished. His name was never recorded, his story never told, and his existence was swallowed not just by the freezing Atlantic, but by the silence of forgotten records. To the world, he became a ghost, neither counted among the living nor mourned as dead. In the weeks and months after the disaster, countless families searched for missing loved ones, clinging to hope or grieving without closure. For this man, No relatives could claim him. No official recognition could validate his life or death. His burned passport was a symbol of erasure, a tragic reminder of the many who vanished into anonymity, not just by the waves, but by the loss of identity itself. His story echoes a dark truth about migration, survival, and the fragile nature of human records. Sometimes, the desperate attempts to escape one fate can lead to a final, irreversible disappearance. A life lost twice over, fading into history's shadows, remembered only by the empty space where a name should have been. The frozen champagne bottles. Beneath the Titanic's grand ballrooms and first-class dining salons, where crystal chandeliers sparkled and the clink of fine glasses filled the air, lay the ship's cold storage, a place meant to preserve the luxury and indulgence that defined the voyage for its wealthiest passengers. Here, rows upon rows of champagne bottles were carefully chilled, their delicate contents awaiting celebration and toasts to new beginnings. But as the disaster unfolded and the ship began its descent into chaos, the temperature in these storage compartments plummeted far below normal refrigeration levels, turning the once sparkling bottles into eerie, frozen relics. Passengers who later survived and told their stories described the chilling sight of champagne bottles trapped solid in thick ice, their liquid content transformed into a suspended icy mass. The fine bubbles that once danced inside the glass were caught mid-rise, frozen in time beneath layers of frost that coated the bottles like crystalline armor. The corks remained tightly sealed, their wooden stoppers encased in frost, preserving the silent, frozen promise of celebration that would never come. Some bottles cracked or shattered from the expansion of the freezing liquid inside, their delicate glass breaking with a sound lost beneath the roar of rushing water and panicked cries. This haunting image of frozen champagne stands as a stark and tragic symbol of the night's cruel inversion. What began as a journey filled with luxury, hope, and joy ended with the finest indulgences halted, suspended forever in ice, an unintentional monument to the disaster's cold grip. The frozen bottles embody the collision of opulence and catastrophe, the fragile beauty of a world caught abruptly between life and death. They serve as silent witnesses beneath the waves to the dreams and celebrations that turned to sorrow and loss. In the icy depths, the champagne sleeps eternally, bottled moments of joy locked forever in the Titanic's frozen tomb. The coal fire that weakened the hull. Long before the Titanic set sail on her doomed maiden voyage, a slow-burning threat was silently consuming her from within. Deep in the ship's massive coal bunkers, hidden beneath tons of black fuel, a fire had ignited, a smouldering blaze that went unnoticed by most of the crew and completely unknown to the passengers. This coal fire, which had likely started weeks before departure, burned relentlessly, feeding on the dense piles of coal and steadily generating intense heat that warped and weakened the ship's steel frame. Efforts to contain the fire were desperate but limited. Crew members worked tirelessly, shoveling fresh coal atop the glowing embers in a grueling attempt to starve the flames of oxygen. Yet the fire persisted, gnawing away silently, weakening the very foundation that was meant to keep the Titanic afloat. The heat affected the steel plates, making them brittle and prone to cracking, and compromised the rivets that held the hull together, leaving the ship vulnerable in ways that would never be visible to the eyes of those enjoying the luxury above decks. Unaware of the invisible enemy beneath their feet, passengers dined, danced, and dreamed of a future that would soon be swallowed by the cold Atlantic. When the Titanic finally collided with the Iceberg, the damage was far more severe than anticipated. The already weakened hull buckled and tore with a ferocity that may have been lessened if the steel had been intact and strong. The coal fire had effectively turned a catastrophic accident into an unstoppable disaster. This hidden blaze, concealed in the dark bowels of the ship, was a slow poison that sealed Titanic's fate long before the iceberg's deadly strike. As the ship sank beneath the waves, The fire's last embers were extinguished by the cold sea, disappearing into the depths. Yet beneath the ocean floor, the legacy of that coal fire remains, a silent testament to the unseen dangers that can lurk within even the mightiest human creations, and a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest threats are those burning quietly out of sight. The man who sold his ticket. In the cold, overcast days leading up to April 10th, 1912, a man stood in the cobbled streets of Southampton, or perhaps Queenstown, holding in his hand a ticket to the grandest ship ever built, a third-class passage aboard RMS Titanic, bound for New York City. It was a golden key to a new world, one that promised hope, work, and escape from poverty. But desperation has a strange way of shifting value. Faced with mounting debts, or perhaps a family emergency, the man made a choice that seemed small in the moment. He sold his Titanic ticket. Maybe it was to a stranger, maybe to a friend, maybe even to someone who begged for it. The details are blurred by time, but the outcome is not. That single exchange would be the hinge upon which two fates would pivot, one toward death, the other towards silent survival. The man who bought the ticket was young, ambitious, and likely unaware that the passage he just acquired was more than a seat. It was a final destination. When Titanic set sail, carrying dreams and luxuries and lies of unsinkability, he stood among hundreds of hopefuls below deck, packed into the third-class cabins with other immigrants eager for a fresh start. But as the iceberg struck and the panic spread, third class was not salvation, it was a trap. Locked gates, flooded passageways, miscommunication, and pure neglect meant that most never had a chance to reach a lifeboat. The man who bought the ticket that wasn't meant for him likely died that night, drowning in darkness, surrounded by screams, clutching to hope until the sea tore it away. And the seller? He awoke the next day, dry, warm, alive. Maybe he heard the news from a newspaper hawker, or maybe the rumors reached his town days later, like the aftershock of an invisible quake. Maybe he froze in place, realizing that the paper he traded for coins had become a tombstone in someone else's hands. Or maybe he said nothing at all. Maybe he walked into a quiet life, haunted but hidden, carrying the knowledge that his place on the Titanic was filled by a ghost with his name on the manifest. In the confusion that followed the sinking, with names misrecorded, bodies unnamed, and tickets resold quietly in port towns, no one could confirm the truth. But it lingered. Stories were whispered in pubs and family circles. A man who should have died didn't. A man who dreamed of America vanished into black water. The exchange had no paperwork, no witnesses, just a silent deal made in desperation, one that turned a simple sail into a passing of fate itself. And so, one man walked the earth with death on his heels, saved by the cruelest form of luck, selling his place on a ship that became a legend, and leaving another soul to wear his name as it disappeared forever into the sea. The frozen ship's paint. Beneath the gleaming grandeur of the Titanic's hull lay a quiet, fatal flaw, one that had nothing to do with icebergs or lifeboats or fires in the coal bunkers. It was in the very skin of the ship itself. The paint. Designed to protect the steel from corrosion and extreme temperatures, Titanic's hull was coated with a special mixture of lead-based marine paint, a common and trusted solution in early 20th century shipbuilding. But what engineers didn't account for was the way this paint would react in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. Its chemical stability turned brittle in the intense cold. As temperatures plummeted the night of April 14th, the layers of paint along the hull began to freeze solid. What should have flexed and moved with the steel instead became stiff, inflexible armor that cracked when pressure was applied. Modern metallurgists have suggested that this brittleness may have significantly worsened the damage when Titanic struck the iceberg. Instead of absorbing and distributing the impact, the frozen paint shattered and flaked off in chunks, exposing bare steel to the crushing force of ice. The hull plates, already weakened by the cold and possibly the long-burning coal fire in Bunker 6, gave way with frightening ease. Witnesses reported a sound not of one massive tear, but of many, a series of grinding, cracking, wrenching noises, as if the very skin of the ship was being peeled back. Some believe this noise was not just the steel itself giving way, but the frozen, splintering paint bursting apart in jagged sheets. In the aftermath, long after the wreck settled on the ocean floor, investigators discovered curious patterns in the damage, fractures that lined up too cleanly, too sharply, as though aided by something else, something hiding in plain sight. The paint, that silent coat of protection, had become a razor-thin vulnerability. It's a haunting detail that something as mundane, as overlooked as paint, may have helped doom a ship praised as unsinkable. The Titanic's greatest enemy may not have just been the iceberg or the freezing sea, but the invisible, quiet betrayals built into her very surface, waiting to shatter under the weight of one perfect disaster. The poisoned lifeboat food. As the Titanic slipped beneath the black waves and survivors scrambled into the lifeboats, few thought of food, yet it was there, packed tightly beneath benches or in hidden compartments, emergency provisions meant to sustain those adrift until rescue arrived. Each lifeboat was stocked with tins of hardtack biscuits, small kegs of drinking water, and sometimes meat or condensed milk. But in the panic of the launch, in the confusion of the cold and dark, no one checked how long those rations had sat in storage or what had seeped into them. In the days that followed, survivors began to suffer. Some who drank from the barrels became violently ill, vomiting into the already crowded boats, their bodies racked with cramps and delirium. Others who tried to stomach the damp, stale biscuits found themselves weak, dizzy, and unable to keep food down. It was later believed that some of the water had been contaminated, either by rust from the storage containers, chemicals from cleaning products in nearby compartments, or simple bacterial growth from improper sealing. And the biscuits, already dense and barely edible, may have absorbed moisture tainted by mold or rot. In an ocean filled with death, the lifeboats had become floating coffins of their own. Sick passengers huddled beside the dying, their lips crusted with salt, their stomachs churning with spoiled food meant to keep them alive. For some, it was not the freezing cold or the trauma that wore them down, but the very provisions they had clung to for hope. These emergency rations, untouched until disaster forced them open, became grim symbols of the Titanic's deep and layered failures, how even in survival, nothing was safe, and everything, down to a sip of water, could betray them. Today, tucked in museums and private collections, are unopened tins from Titanic's lifeboats, relics of desperation never consumed. Their labels have faded, but their warning remains, that even salvation, when poorly prepared, can turn poisonous. The ship's cat disappeared. Among the many living souls aboard the Titanic was one small creature, often forgotten in the grand retelling of tragedy. A ship's cat, known to some crew members simply as Jenny. She had been brought aboard during Titanic's outfitting in Belfast, transferred from her sister ship, Olympic, to serve a humble but important purpose, to control the growing population of rats in the lower decks. Jenny was no ordinary stray. She was well fed, known to nap near the kitchens, and even rumoured to have had a litter of kittens shortly before departure. To some of the crew, especially the stokers and stewards who saw her daily, she was a quiet comfort, an omen of safety, a living heartbeat among the metal and steam. But then something strange happened. Days before Titanic left Southampton, Jenny was seen acting unusually restless. According to surviving crew members, she moved her kittens one by one off the ship, vanishing without a trace. No one knew where she went. She had been seen pacing near the gangplanks, agitated, meowing constantly, Then, nothing. Some believed she had sensed something. Others thought she had simply wandered off. A mother searching for safety on dry land. But when Titanic sailed on April 10th, Jenny and her kittens were gone. At the time, most dismissed it. A cat was a cat. Curious, unpredictable, easily spooked by the noise of the engines or the chaos of boarding. But after the sinking, her disappearance became something else entirely. A whisper. A story passed between survivors. A quiet superstition given new weight by death. Had Jenny known something? Had she sensed doom in the steel and smoke and sea? For decades, sailors would recount her tale as more than coincidence. How the ship's animal, so tuned to the rhythms of nature, refused to sail and vanished before disaster struck. Today, Jenny's fate remains a mystery. No records exist of her ever being found. Her name appears in no official documents, her kittens unaccounted for. But her story endures, not just as a charming footnote, but as a symbol of instinct, of warnings ignored, of something pure and wordless that tried to escape what thousands could not. In a disaster filled with missed signs and fatal pride, the quiet disappearance of one small cat echoes as perhaps the only creature wise enough to leave before it was too late. The Locked Mailroom. Deep within the Titanic's lower decks, past the grand dining rooms, and far beneath the glittering chandeliers of first class, was a room few passengers ever saw, but one that carried the beating heart of countless lives left behind. The mailroom. Titanic was more than a luxury liner. She was a Royal Mail ship, entrusted with over 3,400 mailbags containing letters, documents, personal belongings, even small parcels bound for the Americas. Some were love letters, others held contracts, wills, private diaries, family photographs, the fragile echoes of ordinary lives suspended between continents. But when the ship struck the iceberg and water began to pour into her iron belly, the mailroom was one of the first compartments to flood. Within minutes, icy seawater surged through the floor, soaking paper, ink, and string in a freezing tide. 5 postal clerks, dedicated men from Britain and the United States, worked feverishly to save what they could. With water rising around their knees, then their waists, they passed mailbags from hand to hand, dragging sacks of correspondence up ladders towards safety. None of them survived. All 5 drowned in their attempt to protect letters that would never reach their destinations. Later accounts spoke of locked doors, mailroom vaults sealed tight by heavy brass and bureaucratic rules, never to be opened again. Thousands of letters were lost forever, many written by immigrants to loved ones waiting on the other side of the ocean. Some were farewells, some were confessions, some were apologies never read. The Atlantic swallowed them all, and unlike diamonds or gold, these were irreplaceable, the final words of people whose voices would now never be heard. To this day, on the ocean floor, sealed leather pouches and disintegrating envelopes lie buried beneath rust and salt. Some letters have been recovered, water-stained and barely legible, preserved in eerie silence. They are ghosts in ink, fragments of thought frozen in time. And every time one is found, it is not just a relic, it's a conversation reopened, a final sentence retrieved from the dark. The mailroom remains one of the Titanic's most quietly tragic losses, not of riches, but of human connection, silenced forever behind a locked door that the sea alone holds the key to. The Orchestra's secret pact. In the shadows of Titanic's opulent decks and gilded dining halls stood 8 men whose instruments were not just tools of beauty, but anchors of calm in chaos. The Titanic's band, led by violinist Wallace Hartley, was more than just entertainment. It was a moving force, expected to fill the ship's air with elegance, dignity, and composure. But as the ship began to sink and reality tore the glamour apart, the orchestra made a choice that would echo through eternity. not by accident or duty, but through a secret pact whispered among themselves when the first shudder ran through the steel beneath their feet. They agreed, no matter what happened, they would not stop playing. It wasn't just an act of bravery. It was a silent vow among musicians who knew that the sea was coming for them, but believed their music could hold the fear at bay just long enough. As lifeboats lowered, as screams rose, and as water flooded the corridors, the band stood on the open deck, in the bitter cold, shoulder to shoulder, their fingers numb and faces pale, coaxing melodies into a night that had already begun to die. They didn't run. They didn't beg for spots on lifeboats. They played, not out of hope for survival, but out of quiet solidarity, perhaps even defiance. Survivors later recalled hearing them long after logic said they should have stopped. Some claimed the music echoed across the water. Others say it followed them in their dreams for years. The final tune is still debated. Some swear it was Nearer, My God, to Thee. Others say it was a cheerful waltz meant to keep panic at bay. But what's clear is this: not a single member of the band survived. Their pact held to the end. They sank with their instruments in hand. Hartley's body was later recovered, frozen, with his violin strapped across his chest. It had absorbed the salt of the sea and the weight of history, and when it resurfaced nearly a century later, it was cracked, warped, and water-stained, but still whole, like the memory of what they did. That violin now rests behind glass, silent forever. But the pact they made lives on, not as music, but as myth. 8 men who stared into the eyes of death and chose to answer it with harmony. Not a scream, not a prayer, but a final note, trembling on the edge of the abyss. The hidden cargo of luxury furs. Below the Titanic's gleaming decks, and behind the illusion of floating perfection, lay a cavernous belly filled with far more than trunks and tea crates. Hidden deep in the ship's storage holds, buried among mailbags, coal, and provisions, was a secret cargo known only to a handful of crew and select elite. A collection of rare, expensive, and extravagant luxury furs. Arctic fox, silver mink, sable, chinchilla, prized pelts from the farthest corners of the empire, destined for high society boutiques and private parlors in New York. They were worth a fortune, packed carefully in climate-protected crates under lock and key, meant to be quietly transported with discretion to avoid attention or theft. But when Titanic struck the iceberg, the fur vault became nothing more than an underwater tomb for fashion's finest. As the icy waters crept through the cargo decks, flooding steel corridors and extinguishing lanterns, those crates sank without a struggle, their contents slowly becoming soaked, compressed, ruined. By the time the ship split apart and the stern rose into the sky, the luxury furs, once symbols of status, vanity, and wealth, were dissolving into wet clumps of rot at the bottom of the sea. Not a single one was ever recovered in usable condition. Those that were found decades later, dredged up during deep-sea exploration, were bloated with salt water, blackened by time, their softness long since replaced by decay. Yet their presence is a chilling metaphor. While people above fought for places in lifeboats, screamed in terror, or froze in the dark, hundreds of pounds of luxury sat in silence, untouched, useless, sinking beneath the very people who once paraded such things through society's most exclusive halls. These furs, once destined to adorn the shoulders of Manhattan's elite, now lie entombed miles beneath the ocean, matted, forgotten, and grotesquely transformed. The hidden cargo of luxury furs is no longer a footnote in shipping logs. It's a dark symbol of the Titanic's twisted irony. The finest things money could buy, reduced to rot in a moment where no coat, no status, no fortune could protect you. In the deep, where time no longer matters, fur and flesh meet the same silent end. The missing lifeboat collars. Among the many oversights that doomed so many aboard the Titanic, one hauntingly simple detail is rarely spoken of. Lifeboats launched without their flotation collars or basic life-saving equipment. These collars, designed to help the wooden lifeboats stay buoyant and stable in rough seas, were supposed to be standard, filled with cork or airtight materials to keep the boats from capsizing or taking on water. But on the night of April 14th, in the frantic rush to lower the boats, several were missing these crucial features, either because they were never properly equipped, or because safety checks were rushed or ignored in the chaos. Some lifeboats took on water almost immediately, forcing survivors to bail with their bare hands, soaking their bodies further in the freezing air. Others floated so low and unevenly that passengers feared every movement might tip them over. One boat, Lifeboat 14, had to be partially emptied and redistributed because it threatened to swamp under its own weight. Another had no lantern, no drinking water, and no thermal coverings. These weren't vessels of rescue. They were stripped-down wooden shells floating in the pitch-black Atlantic, barely keeping their occupants above death. Passengers clung to soaked benches, huddling in silence, too afraid to shift their weight, while the ocean lapped over the edges of boats that were never fully prepared to save them. In one lifeboat, a baby nearly slipped overboard during the night due to the instability of the craft, only saved by a stranger's trembling grip. This lack of basic preparedness wasn't an accident. It was negligence dressed as confidence. The White Star Line had insisted Titanic was virtually unsinkable. Why properly outfit the lifeboats if they'd never truly be needed? Why do full drills? Why check the cork, the lanterns, the oars, the food, the water? In that arrogance, safety was sacrificed for elegance. The missing collars on the Titanic's lifeboats weren't just forgotten equipment. They were quiet, invisible killers. They were the kind of failure no one saw until it was far too late, when the sea came clawing over the sides, and terrified survivors realized they had escaped the sinking ship, only to find themselves adrift in fragile, flawed vessels, staring into the dark and waiting for death to find them anyway. The lifeboat drill that never happened. On the morning of April 14th, 1912, the very day the Titanic would strike the iceberg, there was supposed to be a lifeboat drill. The crew had prepared for it. The ropes were set, officers assigned, passengers informed. It would have been the ship's first full-scale test of its evacuation process, a chance to rehearse the use of lifeboats, explain the procedures, and check how passengers and crew would react in a real emergency. But for reasons never officially explained, Captain Edward Smith abruptly cancelled the drill. No announcement was made, no justification given. One of the most crucial safety exercises on board the largest moving object ever created was simply abandoned. It's a decision that haunts maritime historians and survivors alike. Had the drill occurred, passengers might have been familiar with where to go. Crew members might have known how to fill lifeboats efficiently. Panic may have been replaced with order. And maybe, just maybe, more than 1,500 people wouldn't have died in the freezing darkness that night. Instead, confusion reigned. Passengers didn't understand the urgency. Lifeboats were launched half empty. Crew argued about who could board and how. Women and children were separated from loved ones without explanation. Chaos bloomed in the void where discipline might have been. Some speculated that the drill was cancelled to allow passengers to enjoy a final relaxing Sunday at sea, uninterrupted by loud whistles and crowds gathering around lifeboats. Others believed it was due to Captain Smith's overconfidence in the ship's safety, or pressure from the White Star Line to avoid making guests nervous. But whatever the reason, that unspoken cancellation became one of Titanic's darkest, most preventable mistakes. Not an act of malice, but of negligence. The ghost of a decision that never made a sound, but left behind an ocean of silence. And in that silence, history asks one simple, painful question. What if the ropes had been lowered that morning? What if just one dry run had prepared the people for the real thing? What if that drill, the one that never happened, had saved them all. The wealthy who refused to leave. As the icy Atlantic crept up the decks and the orchestra played its mournful melodies, not all first-class passengers scrambled for the lifeboats. Some of the wealthiest individuals aboard the Titanic, wrapped in furs and surrounded by the finest luxuries of the Edwardian world, made a choice that shocked even the crew. They refused to leave, not out of courage, not out of honor, but out of stubborn pride, or worse, attachment to their earthly possessions. Jewels, cash, heirlooms, fine art, dogs bred from royal bloodlines. In the confusion of the evacuation, several ultra-rich passengers balked at the idea of leaving everything behind. They were told there was no room for trunks. They were told pets couldn't be taken. They were told the lifeboats weren't private suites, but cramped, freezing vessels filled with strangers. And so, a few declined. They turned back, returned to their rooms. Some tried to collect valuables from safes. Some sat in silence, sipping brandy, as if waiting for someone to fix the problem. A few were even witnessed dressing formally for the end, donning their finest clothes as if death itself deserved a proper introduction. The most famous of these was Benjamin Guggenheim, a millionaire industrialist who reportedly changed into evening wear and told a steward, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." His companion and valet stayed by his side. They refused the boats. They refused to run. They refused to let the sea take them without dignity. Others weren't so poetic. One heiress refused a lifeboat because her diamond necklace hadn't been recovered from her suite. Another woman offered a seat, demanded her St. Bernard be placed aboard with her, or she'd stay behind. The dog was too large. She remained. Their stories are haunting reminders of what happens when wealth and illusion refuse to bow to reality. As the Titanic tilted and broke, fortune meant nothing. The diamonds sank. The cash rotted. The bloodlines drowned. And the first-class parlor suites, polished and perfect, became tombs lined with velvet and ivory. Those who stayed behind didn't meet tragedy. They embraced it, clutching their treasures as if they could barter with the sea. In the end, their choices left no legacy of luxury, only the cold, bitter lesson that no amount of gold can float, and that death does not knock politely at the doors of the rich. It comes through the floorboards, and it does not care what you wear. The blacklisted third-class passenger. Amid the noise, the opulence, and the chaos of the Titanic's voyage, tucked away in the crowded, windowless corridors of third class, there was a passenger whose name did not appear on standard boarding logs, but on a different kind of list. This man, never officially confirmed by surviving crew, but whispered about by others in the know, was allegedly under quiet surveillance. According to dockside rumours and later reports passed among maritime historians, he had been blacklisted by British authorities before ever stepping aboard. Not for a crime of violence, but for ideas. He was thought to be an agitator, a political dissenter, a man with dangerous thoughts in his pockets rather than weapons, suspected of spreading revolutionary rhetoric among labourers and immigrants. In the tense political climate of early 20th century Europe, as workers' strikes erupted and anarchist movements gained ground, the governments of Britain and America had begun quietly monitoring certain individuals they feared might stir unrest. Surveillance extended even to transatlantic ships, where migrants were screened not only for illness, but for ideology. And so, it's believed this third-class passenger was allowed aboard Titanic, but followed, observed, watched, perhaps even reported on, by a secret informant travelling the same route. His cabin was deep in the ship's lowest levels, among those who had paid the least but risked the most for a new life. No one knows if he spoke of his beliefs to others on board. No one knows if he feared being arrested upon arrival in New York. And no one knows what happened to him after the iceberg struck. Like so many in steerage, he likely never reached the deck. The locked gates, the language barriers, the lack of time, all conspired to keep hundreds trapped below. His file, if one existed, was never closed. it was drowned, but his presence lingers like a shadow on the margins of Titanic's story. A ghost, not of superstition, but of secrecy. He was not rich, not famous, not mourned in newspapers, just another number lost to the sea. Yet beneath the Atlantic, alongside jewelers and millionaires, rests a man whose words may have once shaken empires, silenced forever in a ship built to carry dreams, and capable of burying truths just as easily. The cabin full of silence. In the deepest reaches of third class, far from the polished staircases and gleaming chandeliers of the Titanic's upper decks, there was a cabin where time seemed to freeze before the water ever arrived. Survivors who passed through those lower corridors in the early stages of the evacuation would later whisper about what they saw behind one half-open door. A group of passengers, mostly women and children, sitting perfectly still in a small, dimly lit room. No screaming, no movement, just silence, as if they had already accepted what was coming. They were immigrants, most likely, families who had already left everything behind just to step foot on the ship. Many didn't speak English. Some couldn't read the signs. And when the Iceberg struck, the confusion was instant and overwhelming. In those low-ceilinged corridors where pipes lined the walls and the hum of the engines had once been constant, it was suddenly cold, eerily quiet, and full of whispers in languages no one came to translate. The gates that separated third class from the rest of the ship remained locked for precious minutes. Panic spread elsewhere, but here, in this single cabin, it never took root. Instead, they sat. Mothers with children in their laps, elderly couples holding hands, faces turned toward the door, but not moving through it. Maybe they were praying. Maybe they believed they were supposed to wait for instructions that never came. Or maybe they simply knew, deep down, that there would be no instructions, that in the grand scheme of class and money and maritime pride, no one was coming for them. When the water came, it came without warning, cold, black, and rising fast. No one knows who those passengers were. They were never identified. Their names were lost in the confusion of garbled manifests and unreadable handwriting. But their silence was remembered, by a steward who passed by too quickly to help, by a stoker who never forgot their stillness, and by the haunted memory of the room that waited for death, not with panic, but with quiet resignation. They didn't run. They didn't scream. They didn't beg. They just sat, holding on to one another, in a small cabin now buried 2 miles beneath the surface. A room where no voice rose, and no one survived. A place forever sealed in the silence it chose. The passengers who slept through the sinking. One of the Titanic's most haunting and rarely discussed secrets involves the passengers who, tragically and unknowingly, slept straight through the disaster itself. Far below the grand ballrooms, elegant staircases, and luxurious suites of the upper classes, the third-class cabins hummed quietly with the constant rhythm of the engines and the gentle sway of the ship cutting through the cold Atlantic waters. Here, weary immigrants, exhausted from long journeys by land, sea, and dreams of new beginnings, slept deeply, lulled into peaceful rest by the reassuring heartbeat of machinery and the muffled sounds of the ocean outside. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, for many of these passengers, the collision felt like nothing more than a distant shudder, a subtle shift in the ship's rhythm, hardly enough to stir them from sleep. With no immediate alarms or clear instructions reaching these remote compartments, countless passengers remained asleep in their bunks, unaware that water was silently flooding the decks beneath their feet. Crew members tasked with alerting third-class passengers struggled to reach everyone, hindered by language barriers, locked gates, and confusion in the rapidly deteriorating chaos. Passengers in isolated rooms and far-flung corners of the ship remained untouched by initial panic, cocooned in ignorance as cold seawater slowly seeped into their cabins. They simply never woke, their dreams transitioning silently into death without ever comprehending the nightmare unfolding around them. Hours later, when the few rescue ships arrived, survivors spoke with horror of bodies discovered floating in flooded cabins, still dressed in nightclothes, lying peacefully as if still asleep. Faces serene, frozen in time, unaware of the terror that had claimed them. To rescuers and survivors alike, the image of passengers quietly drowned in their sleep became one of the Titanic's most disturbing legacies, a grim reminder of just how silently tragedy can steal life, how easily safety can become a quiet tomb, and how quickly dreams can transform into eternal rest beneath the cold, indifferent sea.